people who live downtown have been seeing you guys having dinner with Brian for years and years. How long did it take you to make the movie, and when did you decide to make these conversations into a movie?
Well, they were done about, I guess, a little over 5 years ago is when we actually did it. We did it over the course of a week, and I guess, I don't know. It was leading up to that. I think we both wanted to do it for ourselves. I mean, just in some ways, just to memorialize our friendship and the discussions that we were, versions of the discussions we were having anyway. But we also wanted to do something that was complete and go through Brian's whole career, and felt like it was a kind of opportunity to really, to just sort of have it all there. And we approached him about it, and he was open to it, so we thought we better just do this now. And but I think even while we were doing it, we kind of knew, we had the movie in mind, but we were also thinking, if we don't, it's okay if it doesn't actually become an actual movie. But then over the years, we would just keep talking about it, and when I was making other films, I would always sort of take the drive and nudge it towards some assistant and say, why don't you start organizing what you find on here? And that's sort of, it took a few of enterprising assistants to kind of get it into some kind of organization, because there was a lot of interviews, and then so that we could kind of get into it.
I mean, I'll add one thing. There was a thing once we started speaking with Brian where there was a sort of electricity from him when I think we realized after the first day, like, this really is something, and it feels maybe more movie-ish than we realized it would be, where maybe initially it was something we were going to get for ourselves and for posterity and for all this sort of stuff, and then suddenly there was this sort of electric response from him, and then we were sort of off and running.
Did he enjoy it? Has he seen it? Does he enjoy it?
Did he enjoy the interviews or the movie itself? Both. Yes, and yes.
Yeah, I mean, he's very positive about the movie, and the interviews themselves were kind of an extension of our friendship. You know, we did it, that's my living room, and we did it, so it was a very comfortable environment. It was just, you know, me and Noah, and, you know, we were the crew, and so we kept it in the same spirit of having coffee with him or lunch or dinner or something. Yeah,
and we both knew we were going to cover things that we already knew the answers to, but we also, it was so much more thorough than any kind of casual conversation that we went into all this sort of new territory.
I mean, one of the things about Julie Solomon's book that's so wonderful is that Brian was so open with her, and he loves the book, even though, you know, it's him in his most difficult situation.
It's kind of a phenomenon.
Pardon?
It's kind of a phenomenon in a way.
Did you find that he was readily available to you, or were there things that he didn't want to deal with?
Well, I think in terms of what we were interested in, he was totally available. I mean, I think we wanted to talk about filmmaking and process, and it wasn't a gossipy conversation. It wasn't like we were going to go in areas that might, you know, have been uncomfortable for him. I think and as we were saying, I think because we already were having these conversations and they were so interesting to us, it wasn't difficult. We really kind of would let him guide, you know, knowing that we were going to, you know, we were going in order, and but we would let him kind of, you know, lead the way. We might go back and ask further questions and try to get some answers that, you know, that he wasn't, we might have a take on something that he doesn't see it that way, but we would just sort of let that go. It wasn't about, I guess it wasn't about trying to get answers out of him that we already had in our head. We really were kind of trying to remain open to the way he wanted to tell it.
And I think most of the stuff, when he talks about his life or personal things in his life, they're sort of intersecting, you know, but from questions that are really about the making of these movies. So he'll say, this is affected by this thing that happened in my life, as opposed to what were you doing, or what was that relationship like, or any of those kinds of things. I think in general we just weren't that interested in that stuff.
Okay. Questions out here? Is there someone with a mic out here or not? Yeah. Questions? Yeah, blue shirt.
Hi, I'd like to ask both Noah and Jake, what do you think is the best Brian De Palma film? And for each of you, what is your favorite Brian De Palma film?
That's always very difficult. I mean, I guess I think the best one is probably Blowout, if I have to give an answer. But that's sort of my answer today. I don't know if I would necessarily say that, another day. And then personal favorite really is just the one that was on my mind most recently was Carlito's. I found myself revisiting a lot lately. But my love for them is, I think, much bigger than that.
Yeah, I find it in some ways, having spent so much time with Brian and going through these movies and also watching them all repeatedly, looking for the clips and the conversation. I almost feel the way I would if someone asked me my favorite of my own movies. It's that way that I don't feel comfortable answering. That there's something about all of them, or different ones that depending on the day or the moment, that I feel a kind of relationship with. I mean, and in a way, it's so much about how we feel about him too, that I think that I haven't thought about the movies that way, in terms of favorite or best.
And I think for both of us, the movies are sort of elemental. I mean, it's sort of one of the first ways of seeing the way one person saw this movie landscape, and it's really etched in our, on our own sensors, sort of. And in a way, that's, I think, one of the components of our friendship. And then this friendship, we had these separate friendships with Brian that then all sort of grew together. But Brian and his movies is the core, I think, really of that.
Yeah, a hand right in the middle here.
Hi, thank you. What did you uncover during these interviews that were most surprising to you about Brian?
I guess there are not a lot of these things we had a lot of the stories we had heard over the years. So they were things we were revisiting and having him sort of say again. I think the thing that we were both most struck by, tell me if I'm wrong, was just how electric he was on camera, how good he was at sort of telling these stories, how he told them in exactly the same way on camera as he would at dinner, and was so articulate and sort of direct, and they're sort of made for cinema. A lot of this stuff is not chopped up. It's shot with one camera and one angle, and yeah, we're covering things in certain places, but most of the time, we're highlighting what he's talking about is the thing. So that alone is such a great talent, to be able to mine that. And so that would be like the only thing I remember feeling just like, he is really good at doing this on camera.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I think in also in putting it together, because our interest in it was so, in some ways, personal and very much about Brian and our relationship with him, that in then putting it together as a movie was also sort of discovering these other narratives, this sort of story of the film industry that's also kind of, it's kind of baked into Brian's experience, the fact that he, also has worked pretty much in every possible way. I mean, he's worked independently, he's worked on huge studio movies, he's done very personal movies within the studio system, he's come on to movies, after another director left. I mean, he's really done so many versions of what can happen professionally in Hollywood. And I think I wouldn't say surprised, but I think in seeing it all laid out when we were kind of putting it together, that there were these other storylines going on that were very interesting and were not, sort of existing side by side with, just the very sort of matter-of-factness of Brian telling us about his career.
I have one other quick question. Did he talk at all about how, if he were starting a career today, the kinds of fights that he waged and won, did he think he could do that today? because there are very tough directors out there who are walking away from the whole thing because you cannot win those battles anymore.
That'd be a good one to ask him.
Yeah.
Because I think he would wage, the same battles. I just don't know if.
Well, he
such a
had an
different-
experience recently. I mean, I don't necessarily want to get into the specifics of it, but he did have an experience that he walked away from because I think he couldn't. It wasn't. I suppose he felt he wasn't going to be able to get it the way he, was going to. That was going to work for him. I mean, I think, again, I find. I think the movie for me, and I think Jake too, is about directing beyond Brian. It's about filmmaking and about having a career and what it takes to have a career. And as you say, he waged so many battles and won. But you also see how, to have this kind of longevity, even in potentially better times in the 70s, he's still, it's still compromise. It's still, even Brian De Palma has to sort of figure out a way to work within the system. And I think that's, I find it both comforting and interesting to see that kind of articulated as well as he does it.
Way in the back, a pink salmon-colored shirt in the middle.
It's kind of along the lines of this same question, but during the Bonfire of the Vanities section, Mr. De Palma said something about there's people who are paid a lot of money to try and get you to change your mind, something along those lines. So I want to ask you guys as directors, what is this attitude that persists in the system that people think, that tries to make people, brilliant artists change their minds? What is it, and why does it persist, in your opinion?
I mean, I don't know. I haven't really had those experiences, but I would imagine it comes from a similar kind of general, corporate's too negative a word in terms of movies, but this idea that there's a group together that wants to, they buy a book or they buy one of these things, and internally they all have an idea of what they want this thing to be, and then they, select the filmmaker and all that sort of stuff. And probably the first sign of something turning out maybe not the way they all sort of agreed would be best, this stuff starts, the notes and the thing. And I think sometimes then you see certain filmmakers walk away from this because it didn't quite go. And then sometimes it works out. Everybody's of the same mind, and maybe it's a casting thing. So I'm imagining it comes sort of from that thing where, and I don't know how long it's really been going on. I mean, I go sort of by Brian's thing that I guess maybe sometime, or I think he always talks about it like it came out of television, is what he sort of feels, these idea of like writers' rooms and writers as the producers of these things. But I mean, I don't know how different it was back in the day. I don't know if it was any better.
Yeah, right there. Yes. Dark hair, bland shirt.
Since he talks openly and critically about some of his movies, I was wondering if you guys had any difficulty in licensing some of the clips you used.
I mean, making these things in general is such a task. It's just part of, figuring out all that stuff is just a major part, half of the making of a movie like this, really. So, I mean, maybe we hadn't made documentaries, so I think we didn't realize what a component it was. But all that sort of stuff is such a component of it. It's a real undertaking, yeah.
Yeah, right down here. Wait for the mic because they're recording. Yeah.
I'm curious if you had anything else to say about Pauline Kael that maybe you didn't put in the movie.
Is there anything about Pauline Kael that we didn't put in the movie? I mean, there are other mentions of her, I suppose, that are not in the movie. Right.
Yeah. He did say there were some movies that she didn't love. I think.
She didn't love Scarface, I think. But
Right. So there were some, I guess but I don't know if she reviewed them. But I remember he said there were some that she was not a fan of.
Yeah, one right. The woman in the first row.
vertigo, of course, looms very large. Was there something that you discovered about Hitchcock during the making of this, during these talks with De Palma?
Well, I guess I hadn't thought. I like Brian's thing about it being a language. You know, that it's such a defined style and such a defined approach to the telling of these stories, and to look at it that way. I loved that, you know. And then you start to look at it, and there, you know, and Brian probably is the strongest, you know, linguist or whatever than you would say about it or something. But there are probably some other people that have followed it a little bit. But I like that he said that, and when he said it, it was the first time I ever thought about it that way. And then I've thought about it that way ever since he said it. You know, I think of it that way when I think of those Hitchcock movies.
Yeah, the guy on the aisle.
Hi. I was hoping you might both be able to talk just a little bit about how Mr. De Palma's work and style influenced you, particularly early on, and how it's continued to sort of inform your style and your voice as filmmakers.
Isn't it obvious? I mean, you know, Brian, for me, I remember hearing about Brian's movies before I saw them because my parents loved his movies and would talk about them a lot. And there's something about even the way you talk about a Brian De Palma movie is kind of shocking and alluring and interesting. And so by the time I was old enough to start seeing them, you know, which was in the 80s, I think maybe Body Double was the first one I saw in the theater of that kind. I saw The Untouchables also. But I felt like I was kind of being let in on some kind of secret or it felt like the adult world in some kind of peculiar way, or some dark version of the adult world. And that, in a way, that experience of discovering his movies had a big impact on me, and a kind of personal impact on me, and I do feel that when I make my movies, I'm always kind of revisiting some kind of childhood, I don't know, approach to the world, and you know, it can be sometimes more specific or articulated than others, but and so in a way, Brian for me is sort of like what sort of existed as what movies were awaiting me as I got older, and then once you start seeing them, they kind of go into your head and they don't come out, you know, and I carry so many of those images over, you know, and you know, the way I remember them, when I revisit them, I'm always surprised how different they might be than the way I might have remembered them, and they're movies that I just love to keep watching. I mean, it was so much, making this movie, this is the only movie probably I could safely say I'll ever be involved with that I can just keep watching over and over again. I find it so interesting, and then I have a kind of, the sort of personal, the friendship, which has meant a lot to me. So, in that way, it influences what I do.
Yeah, right here.
Yeah.
In the middle.
Hi. I think the Brian very admire John Cassavetes, and I'm wondering that was there any point that he actually considered or thought about like a style of making approach of similar to somewhat like John Cassavetes does, because his movie is mostly, pretty much scripted. So I was curious that, did you ever ask those questions, or how he influenced John Cassavetes or something like that?
How Brian is influenced by John Cassavetes?
Yeah.
I don't think we ever asked that. I think when we talked to him about those early influences, he really talks about the French New Wave, and specifically Godard. Those seem to be the biggest ones for me. But I'm sure from a production standpoint, I bet, making those early movies are probably made in a very similar way, and by the similar, like where you get the equipment. I bet you. We should the kind of thing we should ask him, because it's the kind of thing he would say. Oh, absolutely. You know, I ran into John at the rental house on 58th Street, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's that, even that clip from Greetings, you know, the De Niro jumping up and down, running through the park. There's all that sort of, you know, men leaping and doing, you know, that Cassavetes seems to do, you know, they're always like singing and jumping and running, you know.
Yeah, right over there.
Thank you for the film. After seeing it and sitting here and trying to react to it, I feel like I've been in the head, the conscious and the unconscious of Brian De Palma. And I'm wondering how much you had to edit out of the dialogues you had with him.
Tens of hours, you know, is what it, you know, comes down to. Is it so, you know, so between 30 and 40 hours, I think, of footage, and you know, there's a lot more. You know, I think we really wanted to get all the movies in there, and that was really something from the beginning, and then not affect Brian with, you know, other people talking about Brian, which is, you know, how I've seen most of these other movies sort of be made, and I think this is maybe the most direct version of our approach to that. It's like, you know, what's here, but I think there's a lot more, and I think there's a lot more that's valuable, and maybe like on a DVD or something, it'd be worth putting another hour or two of that stuff. There's a concise version of that stuff too that could be valuable.
The Blu-ray.
Yeah, exactly. The Blu-ray or the streaming something or whatever it's going to be next year.
Streaming supplements.
Could you talk a little bit about Mr. De Palma as a teacher? I've described him as one of the most generous directors I've ever had the privilege of working with. I was the unit publicist for Carlito's Way, and he didn't say a word to me, but I never got kicked out of Video Village. Anything I wanted to see, I got to see, and it was the most amazing experience. And I didn't realize until watching this that he's a teacher. So could you talk a little bit about that?
I really think that's where the movie comes from. I mean, I think you sort of summed it up. That's our experience of Brian too, and that's like exactly not getting kicked out of Video Village. Like, you know, virtually everybody would do that. I mean, that's such a unique thing, and I bet you it's not even conscious. He just doesn't. He's not distracted by that sort of thing, or. But I mean, that's the core of I think why we even made this in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I always knew about home movies, but in going through the timeline of his career, I guess I never quite thought until we were, you know, doing the interviews and then cutting the movie, is that he'd already made Carrie and The Fury and was now going to Sarah Lawrence and making this tiny movie with students, and you know, it's so idiosyncratic and so. But as you know, Brian, as you point out, as you get to know him, and you know that it doesn't actually seem, you know, out of line with the career. It actually seems very much in line with it. But it's still, you know, I don't know any other filmmaker who's done something like that.
More questions? Yeah. One more then.
Good afternoon. One of the things I liked most about this film is that when you go through every film, you're not doing a greatest hits collection. You're talking about Raising Cain and Mission to Mars and Snake Eyes, the movies that are least liked. And someone asked about your favorite De Palma movies. Part of being a De Palma fan usually is that you find the ones that you really like but don't have that sort of great critical reception, and you defend them a lot. So I'm wondering, between the two of you, what are the ones that what are the least appreciated ones that you like the most, that you find yourself sticking up for?
It's a very good question.
Well, when I saw Wise Guys in the theater at the Heights Cinema, which I think is just closed recently or is closing, that "Thank you, Mr. Accavano" that they keep saying when they take the mobster's credit card. It was something that has made me laugh over the years thinking about it. So when we were actually putting the clips in, we wanted to make sure we had a couple "Thank you, Mr. Accavanos" in there. I don't know that I'm ready to fully make a case for Wise Guys, but but I certainly I remember that moment.
Yeah, I'm going to go with your answer, I think. It's too long, I think, to get into the mounted defense. We'd need more.
It's too
people
good
to
a
help.
question.
It's too good a question, that's the way to put it.
Thank you all, both of you, very much. I just wanted to say, when we looked at this for the selection committee, everyone, except me, who's seen them all 10 times, said, oh, this movie makes me want to go back and look at every Brian De Palma movie. And I think that's what's so wonderful about it. So thank you very, very much.
Thanks a lot, Amy.
Thanks,
Thank
Amy.
you.
Thank you, thanks.